Hey there folks, and welcome to the first video for Chapter 3, The Molecules of Cells. So in this chapter we're going to get into what are the most important molecules that our cells use for structure, for food, for communication. Before we get into that though, let's talk about just what basic kinds of compounds it is that we are dealing with. Because we're dealing with a biological setting here inside our cells, the main type of compound that we're working with is organic compounds. Organic just means that they are carbon-based. If you look at all of these molecules here to the right, they all have a spine made up of carbon, or sometimes carbon and oxygen, but mostly carbon. Every single time you see the word organic used to mean something snazzy in a grocery store like organic produce, you now have my free permission to laugh, because all they're telling you is that your produce is carbon-based. All life on this planet is carbon-based. I'd be interested to see some inorganic apples. That'd be really weird. When we are dealing with chemistry in life, with real biochemistry and what it uses, we're dealing with things that are carbon-based. We're dealing with isomers of carbon-based material, and isomers are different versions of the same molecule. They may be oriented in 3D space slightly differently. They may have a slightly different number of electrons in the case of isotopes, like carbon-14, that's for carbon-14 dating. But generally speaking, when we are looking at two different molecules that have the same compound recipe, that have the same number of carbon and the same number of hydrogen and the same number of oxygen, an isomer of one molecule is one that still shares the exact same chemical formula, but has a slightly different structure. It has a different shape. In the case of the vast majority of organic compounds, what we will be looking at, and what we tend to see most often in a biological setting, are hydrocarbons. Hydro for hydrogen, carbon for, well, carbon. It's chemical naming. It's descriptive, but not very creative. It's like biology, but even more so. A hydrocarbon is any molecule that is built mostly, if not exclusively, out of hydrogen and carbon. Like the hydrocarbon example that you see right there to the right, CH4. That's all it is. It's a carbon and 4 hydrogen. That's all it has to its name. All right. Are there other types of organic compounds? Yes, of course, like alcohols, aldehydes, and all of the rest of these compounds here on the right. But as you can see, they are primarily built around a spine, a backbone of carbon. All of these different types of molecules, though, doesn't mean that they're all the same just because they're organic, just because even if they're hydrocarbons. Biological organic molecules have all different types of functional groups that can be added on to the end or somewhere in the middle of the molecule. And depending on what that functional group is and where it's located, it can change how easy it is for the molecule to bind to something else, or where it can bind, or how reactive it can be, how easy it is for it to form a reaction with something else. Most of these functional groups that you see here on the right, and these are the most common functional groups of organic compounds, most of them are what we call hydrophilic. This means water-loving, and it means that they will bond very easily with water. Sometimes this is useful. It means that water can pull a hydrogen off of one of these functional groups very easily, and that may prepare the functional group to help the entire molecule to go into a chemical reaction. It can also be less than helpful if where the bond breaks, or what hydrogen gets broken, isn't at an end where it's easier for the molecule to bind, and instead of prepping the molecule to, say, go into reaction, it may end up breaking the molecule. So there are good and there are not so good times to be hydrophilic. Not all functional groups are hydrophilic, but certainly most of them are. A quick example of a functional group that is not hydrophilic is methyl. And one of the places you'll see a methyl group is when our cells tag an area of DNA to basically turn off those genes and signal to the DNA replicating enzymes inside the nucleus that we don't need that section. We're not using that section in the cell. Or more likely actually than in replication, more like transcription and translation to signal to RNA. We don't need to make a new copy of this. Those directions don't need to be sent out into the cell. This isn't a cell that's using those genes. Things like that. Because we're dealing with a whole lot of carbon and a whole lot of hydrogen, we can get some very large molecules. Very, very large molecules. These are called macromolecules. Macro meaning large, even huge. In macromolecules, you can get polymers. A polymer is a large molecule that's made up of multiple monomers. A monomer is just one unit of that same structure. I would like you to think of DNA for an example. DNA is a polymer of many nucleic acids, many different nuclear bases that are used to build DNA. It's built of repeating cycles and combinations of that smaller subunit of structure. We're going to get into some examples of what this looks like away from DNA, because DNA is very complicated. Macromolecules can be made or broken down through dehydration or hydrolysis, and hydrolysis usually needs an enzyme in order for that to work. A dehydration reaction is one that binds water to another reactant in order to make the new molecule. So you'll have water come in, and you'll have the reactant come in, and hydrogen will get pulled off of both, and it will bind the leftover OH to the main body of the new molecule. Hydrolysis, on the other hand, is when water is being broken down in a way that helps break down the main reactant. So say water will pull a hydrogen off of that existing molecule, and that helps it break down, so you end up getting water as a side product out of the reaction. In hydrolysis means water, lysis means to cut, so you're using water to cut another molecule. Let's talk about one of those places where we can start getting into polymers from monomers. Let's start carbohydrates. We have three major classes of carbohydrates in existence, and we find them all in an organic setting. Monohydrates, let's first actually talk about what carbohydrates are really useful for. Carbohydrates are great fast sources of energy. As you can see, they typically form rings, and this means they're pretty stable. But you don't get a lot of double bonds in a carbohydrate. So while they're pretty stable and they store a decent amount of energy, they're not so strong that they're very difficult for our cells to break down. Remember, glucose, this monomer right here in green, that's glucose as in glycolysis, as in the very first step of cellular respiration. We need to be able to break that down constantly to keep our cells running. So plainly, this needs to be a fairly easy to digest kind of molecule. And it is. Carbohydrates on a larger level are great for a great short, fast-hitting, fast-disappearing store of energy. But this isn't something that you can run on for a very long time. You need to consume tons of carbohydrates to keep yourself running, and that's just not the most efficient way of doing that. Monosaccharides refer to one loop versions of carbohydrates, things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. Mono meaning one. Saccharide refers to the class of carbohydrates that they are. Disaccharides, di meaning two, are just two monosaccharides bound together. So in this example, sucrose is a carbohydrate disaccharide that's made of one glucose and one fructose bound together. Polysaccharides are anything more than 2, and they can be very, very long, and they can actually have complex branching structures. An example of this is glycogen, which, as you can see here in that multi-branching structure, is made up entirely of tons of glucose units hooked together all the way down and branching off. You'll find some of these in some pretty interesting places. Let's look at where you can find some of these. Monosaccharides like glucose, you'll find in your food. You'll find glucose and fructose and galactose naturally occurring in fruits and vegetables. Disaccharides and sucrose, well, we find those in larger proportions in things like refined table sugar. Polysaccharides like chitin are actually used to build the exoskeleton of crustaceans like crabs, but also insects like butterflies and beetles. Another example of a polysaccharide that I'm sure you're very familiar with is starch. Like, say, you'll find in cornstarch or potato starch, or even the starch you might use to stiffen up the collar of your work shirts. Alright folks, that's going to wrap it up for the first video for Chapter 3. That one went by fast. Next time we're going to get into some other types of molecules. I'll see you in the next one. Bye folks.